I'm Roberta Glass, and you're listening to my True Crime Report. Today, I'm talking with author Tom O'Neill, author of the great new book, Chaos, Charles Manson, the CIA, and the Secret History of the 60s. So stay tuned. So welcome, Tom O'Neill. So this book is called Chaos. Did you call it Chaos because of the chaos that Manson created, or Project Chaos, or?
It's a play on words. So, people who read the book will understand the double entendre about 2/3 the way through the book. Uh-huh. But the obvious meaning of chaos for the uninitiated who just sees the word, we thought it worked as well, both ways. Sorry, I got a little cough.
It's all right. And so there's also a real kind of like self-conscious bit in this book about you being labeled a conspiracy theorist. Is there any way to write about MKULTRA and this kind of material without being called a conspiracy theorist, do you think?
You got to tell me. I don't know. That was what I was hoping. It was difficult. It's difficult material to approach, and that's why it was really important for me to cite the records I found and just as importantly, all the congressional investigations, and some of them public, that, uncovered what COINTELPRO, Chaos, and MKULTRA did in the 60s. So it's another thing that's on the surface people might suspect is a conspiracy because they just haven't heard about it, or, depending on your age, probably never heard about it if you're born after 1980 or 90. But people who lived through the 60s and 70s, most of them that I speak to remember the MKULTRA hearings and disclosures, as well as COINTELPRO and Chaos, which all happened. The disclosure started about 74, 75, and went through about 77, 78, with the two main investigations being by Frank Church and another one by Senator Ted Kennedy and Senator Daniel Inouye.
So this book started out as an article for Premiere Magazine about the effect of the Manson murders on Hollywood. Did you ever get to answer that question, what the effect of the Manson murders had on Hollywood?
Yeah, I think some of that's in the book. I was never interested in that. That was pretty much what they just threw against the wall when they were trying to get me to do the story, because I didn't really want to do it when they assigned it, because I wasn't interested in the case, or I wasn't interested in the impact on Hollywood. I thought it was pretty obvious that, it caused people to be more frightened of their neighbors, and for Hollywood stars to be more closed off from the public. And I found out a lot more about it, so I hope I filled in some of that. But that was the angle I was hoping to get away from. My editor that assigned it had worked with me for about 10 years at that point, and she was the one who said, just start it that way, and I'm sure you'll find another angle that, will interest you more. And I guess that's what happened since I spent 20 years on it.
Yeah, you definitely found a more interesting angle, but I was really surprised that Hollywood, that no one wanted to talk to you. I mean, in a place where people are not shy about getting their name in print, no one wanted to go on the record.
Especially for Premiere Magazine, because I was used to, when you're writing for a national magazine, Premiere was pretty highly regarded at the time. It was really, except for one other magazine, the only one that covered the film industry exclusively, no television or radio, it was just film. Mm-hmm. And we never had problems getting people to talk to us, especially actors who weren't in their prime. I mean, people who were the age of the people I was trying to speak to in 1999. This was 30 years after the events of the Tate murders and LaBianca murders. So these guys weren't, they were A-list stars, but most of them weren't on the covers of magazines anymore. Warren Beatty, Jane Fonda, those kinds of people, and none of them would talk, and that was pretty unusual for a magazine like Premiere. And I think it was Peter Bart, who had actually been the CEO of Paramount Pictures at the time of the murders, and Paramount was the one that had Roman Polanski under contract. They had released Rosemary's Baby the year before, and Peter Bart was pretty close to the victims and Polanski. And when I told him how none of these people would talk to me, and at this point he was the editor-in-chief, and he still is, I think, of Variety magazine, he said to me, well, there's your story. Why isn't anyone talking? And Dominic Dunn, who was a well-known kind of Hollywood society writer for Vanity Fair, said pretty much the same thing to me. He goes, there's definitely secrets and information that people have been withholding for decades. And he even told me, he said, you'll see in the book, he gave me a couple tips that led to some interesting information. And he said to me, I could never write this story because people would never talk to me again.
Wow. And so you ascribe some of that to the kind of the ideology, live freaky, die freaky. What does that mean, and what did you discover about the goings-on in the Polanski-Tate household before the murders?
Well, I mean, we're calling it the Polanski-Tate household, but Roman and Sharon only lived at Cielo Drive from late January, early February to about the third week of March, and then they both went to Europe, both to do separate projects, and it was during that time that the real freaky stuff started happening when Wojciech Frykowski and Abigail Folger moved in as house sitters for Roman and Sharon, and they were the ones who were letting these kind of miscreants into the house, and other Hollywood stars were going there, and musicians and stuff, and it was turning into quite a scene of, if I say debauchery, it sounds judgmental. I would have gone at the time too, but
right.
A lot of
but
what
Sharon,
was going on.
Sharon Tate was very pregnant, and it's not sort of, I mean, you wouldn't think most husbands would want, that kind of scene.
Well, that was the problem,
around
So Sharon came back, I think it was the day before the moon landing, so that would have been like the 19th or 20th of July. And she was there then for the final 3 weeks of her life, and she wasn't happy with what was going on there. And she was calling Roman in Europe, in London, and this was according to Joanna Pettit, one of her best friends, and begging Roman to come home and/or to get those people out of the house. And I think she actually really, from what I found in the police files and from interviewing that scene, I actually think she was very fond of Abigail. She wasn't too fond of Wojciech, and obviously she loved Jay Sebring. I don't know if there was any romantic love anymore, but she really cared about him. But she shouldn't have been in an environment like that at that stage of her pregnancy, and it wasn't a comfortable pregnancy anyway because of the weather at the time. They were going through a horrible heat wave, and she shouldn't have had to worry about, Billy Doyle and Charles Taco and these lowlifes coming in there and fighting with other drug dealers and Jay and Wojciech, and it wasn't a good environment for her. I still to this day don't know why Roman kept putting off his return.
Well, I mean, I think the only one who comes off worse in this book than Vince Bugliosi is Roman Polanski.
Yeah, well, there's a few people that I think come off even worse than Roman, but Roman, that was difficult for me. I actually found out a lot of stuff that hadn't been reported before about his relationship with Sharon and how he treated her, and I, had a real kind of tug-of-war with my conscience about whether or not to put that stuff in. But when you start hearing it again and again from really credible sources and even seeing it in police files, I felt like I couldn't omit it because the book is also about the leads that the police were choosing to follow. And, I make a big point early on in the book that Roman should have been considered much more of a suspect than he was, even though he was out of the country, because of a videotape that Bugliosi, of all people, told me about. He doesn't come off well at all. I'd never heard a bad thing about Sharon, which is pretty incredible. Because usually there'll be some people that'll, say bad things about someone, and especially, this sounds sexist, I shouldn't say it, but I started, so I'll finish. A beautiful woman, a lot of women would have been jealous of her, but women, men, everybody loved her. I even spoke to some of the people that made deliveries to the house and stuff the last few days. And she is exactly how she's depicted in the Tarantino movie, if you've seen it.
I haven't seen it yet, but she was. Well, I heard that she was freakishly beautiful. That even the police officer saw her in death said, it was in that context was remarked on her beauty. So
yeah,
I don't
that's
think
amazing
it's a sexist remark.
They would have like a reaction like that to a corpse. But I mean, I think a lot of the people I interviewed talked about how beautiful it was, but they always would say it was this inner thing that kind of came out and was magical. And I think that's also probably what came. I used to do celebrity interviews, and I did a big story on Tom Cruise when he was starting, and the director of photography of his first big movie, Taps, famously said that Cruise had a small part in the film, but when they saw him through the camera, there was some kind of magic, and I think Sharon Tate had that too, that only real stars have.
Interesting. And so there's been this rumor of this sex tape, for years. Sometimes Mama Cass Elliot has been included on this orgy sex tape. What did you find out about the sex tape, and how did it come and go from the apartment?
Well, in Bugliosi's narrative, the tape just consisted of Sharon and Roman making love. And it was taken from the loft. Actually, that there was a loft in the living room that had the noose hanging over it that Sharon had been, the coroner believed, hung suspended for, I can't remember how much time he thought, a few minutes or something. It was up there. And then Bugliosi said it was returned to the loft for Roman to find when he went back to the house for the first time after the murders. However, he told me something different in the book. And there was a tape, but he said it was quite different from what he reported in the book. And you'll see how that pans out in the book, how I chase that and try to find out what that meant. I never found that, I think where you're going with your questions is, do those tapes still exist? I wouldn't be surprised, but I went to a lot of the obvious places that they would have been, including a couple of the cops who had a lot of the, you could almost call it memorabilia of the case that they shouldn't have had. Right. And they could have been lying to me, but I never found any existence of it, so I don't know if, how many tapes there were, where they ended up, if they actually were returned. I mean, Vince, that was one of the first lies I should have caught him in, but I didn't because I wasn't that well versed with the case when I first interviewed him in April, but a month after I got the assignment. He told me in that interview that he was the one who told the police to put it back. Right. And in the book, he doesn't say that, and in the book, he makes it very clear that he had nothing to do with this case and didn't even think about it until he got assigned to it, I think November 18th. He repeated that to my lawyers at my publishing house that had the deal, who canceled it later, like 3 or 4 times in these letters, saying I was the one who told the police to put it back. So that was something that I couldn't follow up with Vince once I realized that he was either lying to me the morning, the first interview when he told me he was the one who told the police to put it back, and in his letters to my lawyers at Penguin, or he was lying in the book when he said he had nothing to do with the case until November. I mean, I was catching him. He was tripping up, but unfortunately some of his biggest lies I could never go back and challenge him on because I didn't discover them until after he had cut me off and wouldn't communicate with me anymore in about, I think it was 2007 or 8. So that was frustrating, and that's another reason. I've seen it in a couple of the reviews now. The Washington Post published a pretty good review yesterday. I think it's going to be in the print edition Sunday. And it's by Greg King, an author who wrote a book about Sharon Tate and the murders. But he said that it was probably no accident that the book didn't come out until after Vince Bugliosi's death. And believe me, that was not the case. I wanted the book out while he was alive. I really wanted him to be accountable and to answer these questions from other journalists. that, that he wouldn't answer me or that he lied to me about. And that was one of my biggest disappointments, that he wasn't alive to be held accountable for the findings that I make in the book.
So, just sort of a nerdy question. What kind of videotape existed in 1969?
Oh, they had video cameras. If you look at the police reports, actually some of them aren't available, but I'm pretty sure the homicide investigation report has the evidence. There was video technology. They had video assists like they have now, but they're much higher tech. But Roman was making videotapes. I think he was also doing screen tests with videos at the time. Somebody else has challenged my finding that isn't even in the book, but I've talked about it in interviews. We didn't get the information corroborated in time about the possible attempt on the same four people's lives the night before at the Jay Sebring house, when I said in these interviews that they had settled into Jay's bedroom after Abigail Wojcik and Jay and Sharon had dinner on August 7th, a Thursday night, to watch a cable movie. And believe me, when I found the information, the first thing I did was look at the history of cable.
Right.
And I found out that cable had been invented in the early 60s and was made commercially available in certain, cities, including Los Angeles, by about 66, 67. It was expensive. I think you could get access to one or two stations by subscribing and paying a lot of money, but you could even, when I looked into it first, there wasn't a Wikipedia, or I wasn't familiar with Wikipedia, but if you look at it now, you'll see where they have the history of cable television. You'll see it predated 1969. So the technology was there, but that is a good question, because that was a lot of the challenges of writing this book. I had to look at everything through the, perspective of 1969, how police investigated cases, how laws were enforced, what parole, who would be violated on what kind of parole crimes, that kind of thing. So I had to do a lot of research in legal libraries and to see what the standards were then as opposed to now.
So you just sort of briefly described your what became an adversarial relationship with Bugliosi. Did you ever worry that he would give you false information to sort of send you on to kind of like
I wondered after the fact.
After
the fact, yeah. I wondered if he had told me that. I mean, it was weird. He said to me, and it's in the book, he said to me the day he told me that, I had asked him, it wasn't unsolicited. I had been with him about 5 or 6 hours, and he was very generous and gave me tons and tons of information. But, I've been interviewing people. I hadn't done I've only done one crime story before. I've been interviewing people as a journalist for more than 10 years at that point. And even if you have a prominent person sitting down with you, if they're just telling you what they've told a million other interviewers before, it's not really good. So at the end of the interview, I threw what's called the Hail Mary pass, where you ask them if there's anything they can tell you off the record, not for attribution. And he had said to me, he thought a few minutes and then said, turn it off, referring to my tape recorder. And he said, I don't want to hurt Sharon's memory. I hate to do this, but here's what I'll tell you. And he told me about what he said was on the tape. And you'll find out towards the end of the book why. Well, actually, I've already said it. Once he started writing, referring to it in letters to the publisher when he was beginning what was going to be a lawsuit against me and Penguin, the lawyers all said, he is now gone. That's no longer off the record because everything's going to be available if he's filing this lawsuit. But even since he's told us about this in his letters, you can use it now. And I was like, oh, great, because I wasn't going to attribute to him until he did that. So that's a great question. I wonder that after the fact, because I was already starting to get information that was contradictory to his narrative, and he knew I had a deadline that was a month or 6 weeks away, and I mean, I might be overthinking it, but the fact that you asked the question means maybe I was right. Maybe he invented something knowing that I would get preoccupied with trying to prove that have to get my story out and would throw me off what I was onto that he was concerned about, which was the Terry Melcher question at that time.
Yeah. And so you actually had got some interesting information from Manson's attorney, Irving Kinerick, who had kind of fallen on hard times. What did he tell you about Bugliosi and some of the problems, or in the trial?
Well, he actually didn't fall on hard times. He was never in good times. Even when he was
okay.
Even when he was defending Manson, according to the people.
Oh, really? Okay.
Yeah, the other lawyers, they said, he was living out of his car. So was Ron Hughes.
Ron
wow.
Hughes was,
Yeah, I mean, they really assembled the worst lawyers they could get for the case, except for Paul Fitzgerald, who was a really great, smart lawyer, but God rest his soul, I saw this personally. He had a major drinking problem, and he also had inappropriate relations with, let's just say, with some of the defendant's friends. Okay. So they were all compromised, and Kinerick was, I think Bugliosi might even say it in the book, brilliant, but he was mentally ill, clearly. And when I met him in 99 for the first time, he was living in a horrible hotel, a really dangerous situation with no money. His clothes were ratty. He was just a mess. And but he was still, really, really bright when you could keep him on track. I mean, I almost lost my mind doing this, having to go from an interview with him to Manson, who was just as incoherent, to Vince Bugliosi, who was actually almost as crazy and even scarier than Manson once he became my adversary, as he put it first, not me. So Kinerick was a fascinating figure, and I've heard he's still alive, and he was finally taken in by what I heard were his granddaughters or his daughters, because he had lost all communications with them over the years. And, I think he's about 92 now, so I might reach out to him. I'm on the East Coast, but when I'm back on the West Coast, I might take him out, because he did help me a lot, and I did take him out a couple of times. And, you leave any meeting with him with a huge headache, but I also had this kind of respect for him, because I thought he did the best he could do with, with being afflicted with an illness that I'm sure he would get really upset if he heard this podcast and heard me talking about him, but he wouldn't hear it from me. He heard it from other people long before me.
Well, didn't he start out designing rockets or something like that?
I think he did have another career. He actually became best known first before the Tate LaBianca trial for the Onion Field murders, which became a movie, I think in the 80s maybe. A pretty good movie with James Woods and I can't remember who else, but about the murder of a cop in California. And he represented the defendants in that case, or one of the defendants. And I think that was the early to mid-'60s. Mm-hmm. A lot of lawyers, even people in the prosecutor's office, told me that they had a really high regard for Kinerick, except that, he was such an obstructionist. Nobody wanted to appear opposite him. So he was, you could write a book about half of the characters in this book. I mean, somebody should do a study of Irving Kinerick. If I were a legal scholar, I would love to kind of explore the cases he did and find out whether there was any rhyme or rhythm to his defense strategies. And Bugliosi said it was because of Kinerick that the trial lasted more than a year. I don't know if that's true. I think Bugliosi wanted it to last as long as it did.
I think he tried to get one witness to say that his first name was hearsay because he heard it from his mother. I mean, what a crazy mind to think of that, right?
Yeah, exactly, yeah.
I as a reader, all the stuff with Rudy Altobelli and Kinerick was just, and your interactions with them were just like great fun to read. And I would definitely read a biography of Irving Kinerick. So what did he tell you about Bugliosi, which I thought, so it's coming from like this mentally ill person, and he's telling you about some of Bugliosi's
he was the first
history.
one to tell me about these past cases that Vince had been involved in. And, this was 99. I was not that kind of plugged into the internet, but I can't remember if Google was around. But even if it was, I'm sure if I Googled the information he told me, it would have been difficult to find. So I was not aware of it, that Bugliosi had this history of his own mental illness where, he became convinced that the milkman was the father of his firstborn child, and he started stalking the milkman and harassing him and trying to get him to take a blood test and get his old milk company to release his personal files. And it was just a crazy story. It's all in the book. And when Irving told me that story, and then he also told me about a mistress that Bugliosi had another, well, it's really criminal. I mean, he beat her up and then lied about it to the police and the media because she wouldn't get an abortion, wouldn't abort their child. I guess all of his Achilles heel might have been pregnancy issues with other women, or men.
Yes,
but anyway,
true.
Yeah. So when Irving told me that, I barely even, I put it in my notes, but I didn't take any of it seriously. But he was one of those people that just about everything he told me about, I later found out was true. You just had to cut through all of the excess to figure out what it meant and how important it was. And he also was the first one to tell me about Vince getting indicted for perjury, and it was going to go to trial, except for the fact that the main key witness, the journalist so far, refused to testify, so the judge threw it out. But, Vince writes this authoritative book on the case, and he doesn't mention that he and Dacian were indicted for perjuring themselves during the trial by taking the stand and saying under oath that they had nothing to do with this exchange of information with the reporter Bill Farr that was in violation of a gag order. It's kind of in the weeds, but you can see it in the book. But my point being is that everything Irving told me that first day in wherever it was in Orange County, it went on forever, and I had such a migraine headache at the end of it. But it was worth it. It was worth it because everything he said was true. God bless him.
And so I was really surprised to read that Atkins was going to be the star witness. What happened?
Well, Bugliosi says that in the book, that they didn't want to use her, but at the very beginning of the case, she was all they had. Now, when you read my book, you find out that there was a lot of other stuff going on at the time, and the only reason they had her was because they actually broke the law and had her legally appointed court-appointed attorney removed and replaced with a prosecutor about a week before she and the rest of the family were even identified publicly as suspects in Tate-Polanski. So, I mean, everything that happened at the trial, that happened actually from November 26th when they switched attorneys, we should not trust. I mean, because from that point on, the well was poisoned because they planted a former prosecutor in the defense. That was Richard Caballero and his partner, Paul Caruso. And she was a compromised witness. She was, her best interests weren't being served. The prosecution's best interests were being served without her knowledge. And that's a very important part of our Constitution, is that everybody deserves a defense, no matter how heinous your crime. They deserve a fair, impartial, a partial defense attorney, someone to represent your interests. And she lost that on November 26th when the judge, in collusion with the prosecutor's office, removed her attorney without cause and replaced him with a hand-picked attorney by the prosecutor's office.
And another thing you discovered was the perjury of Terry Melcher. Can you talk about that and a little bit about your interview with him, where you confronted him with some of this?
Well, I mean, Rudy Altobelli, who, as you said a little earlier, was interesting. He owned the house at Cielo Drive, and he lived in the back house, the guest house, and he'd rent out the front. Cary Grant lived there, a bunch of big stars lived there. Terry Melcher lived there with Mark Lindsay, the lead singer for Paul Revere, in '66, I think, and then around '67 or '68, Candice Bergen joined them. She had become Terry's girlfriend, and then Mark Lindsay moved out. So during that period, Rudy became very close to Terry Melcher and also to Dennis Wilson and Greg Jacobson, who's an important prosecution witness. Mm-hmm. So when I approached Rudy for an interview, he had never given an interview in 30 years about his involvement in, what he knew about the murders, the Manson family. He had testified at the trial and given pretty riveting testimony, but never had talked to a journalist. So when he agreed to meet with me, I knew I was lucky, but just like Irving, that was a really frustrating experience. I took him out dozens and dozens of times for very expensive dinners. You can't pay your subjects if you're doing real journalism. You don't pay people for their time, but if you have an expense account, you can take them out for a meal. Uh-huh. So it took a long time to get Rudy to start giving me information, but he was the first one to start telling me what he alleged was the truth about Terry and Terry's relationship with the family, beginning with the fact that the Manson family spent much more time at the house at Cielo Drive, not just Manson, but some of the girls and Watson, than had ever been reported before. And, again, I was taking that with a grain of salt because memories are fragile, and it was 30 years later, and Rudy had his own substance abuse issues. But, I looked into it and eventually was able to get access to documents at the DA's files, and actually in Vince's own hand, and also access to the sheriff's files and the LAPD files, and all of this stuff had never been shared with journalists before. Some of the DA's files had been, but they weren't. They had stopped releasing them, but I was able to get access. And that's where I was able to corroborate what Rudy had said, that not only was Melcher's relationship much more extensive, but it extended beyond the period of the murders, which was a complete contradiction of what he testified to under oath, not just at the Tate-LaBianca trial, but at the Tex Watson trial, and I believe he testified at Leslie Van Houten's retrial.
So, and he's kissing Manson's.
Pardon me?
I mean, he's kissing Manson's feet after the murders. I mean, way more involved than anyone ever knew or I ever knew.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. That was pretty stunning. And again, it was like I went in there very skeptical whenever I did interviews, and I would get this, pretty sensational information from Rudy, Irving Kinerick, other people. As a journalist, that you've always got to, my agent said this too, he said this is why it took me 20 years to write the book. You try to disprove it before you try to prove it. So in other words, through the process of seeing all the different ways they could be wrong and why, then if you can't disprove it, usually you'll find out if it's true or not by doing that. And he said that everything I learned, my agent said this as an explanation to some other publishers at one point when he was trying to sell the book, that I was my own worst enemy and best friend, because it took forever, but best friend because once I put anything in the book, it was definitely, substantiated at least 2-3 times over. Mm-hmm. So Melcher, when I finally encountered him with the information, both from Rudy and also from these reports in two different files, the sheriff's and the DA's, he knew what I was going to ask him then, and it was a pretty dramatic encounter, as you see in the book. And, before I even went to see him, he had called up Rudy, and this was according to Rudy. Rudy said to me, right after this call from Terry, Rudy called me, and he said, Terry's really upset, and he said that, how am I finding all this stuff out, meaning me, Tom, because Vince was supposed to take care of all that, and that was never supposed to come out. So, this was in the first couple of years of my reporting, and when I approached Terry with the documents, showing that it was it was undeniable that he had lied, really, because I also was able to show that he lied just by showing the contradictions in his grand jury testimony, his Tate-LaBianca testimony, and his Watson testimony. His story evolved depending on what Vince needed for each prosecution. And any good defense attorney should have been able to pick that out and impeach Melcher's testimony, but they didn't. But they also were never shown the additional documents I had. I showed them to Paul Fitzgerald and Kinerick, and both of them said they never would have defended the case the way they did if they had that information. It would have been a whole different trial. So when I showed Terry, first he denied it, then he threatened me, and then he asked me to write his memoirs with him.
Yeah, you say something really interesting in this book. You say that getting those threats was almost a good thing because it let you know that you were onto something. Is that a good rule of thumb for a investigator?
Yeah, well, I learned to believe that. I mean, every now and then I thought, well, maybe, it's like Trump's defense when they say that he, when he goes after Mueller and the investigation, his supporters' defense is, well, if you were accused of that, you would threaten people too and try to disrupt and obstruct. Mm-hmm. So I thought about that, but in each case, I decided that no, if they're threatening, it's good. And when Vince sent his first letter to Penguin, threatening to sue them and me if they published my book, and that was 2006 or 7. It was 33 pages, single spaced, with 50 pages of exhibits. I mean, it was like a legal brief, but it was almost incoherent. And the attorney for Penguin, I don't even know if I'm allowed to say it, but oh well, I will. I don't really say this in the book. He said to me first, he said, was he sane when you interviewed him, or did he have dementia, Alzheimer's? And I said, oh no, he's still writing books. He's got a book scheduled for publication next year. He's almost finished his Kennedy book. He's just crazy. But, the lawyer was worried that he had dementia.
Interesting.
And he was only in his early 70s then. And the lawyer told me, he said, the reason I asked is, I was in law school during the trial, and to me, he was a role model. He goes, that case was so expertly prosecuted by him. And to read this letter that he wrote to us, it's like a rambling, incoherent manifesto that makes no sense whatsoever. And he said, I can't believe the same man that wrote Helter Skelter and tried that case wrote this letter. And I said, oh, he did. He did write that. That's him. And he said, well, you've got nothing to worry about. And he said, believe me, they're high-fiving and jumping for joy at the publishing house, because when you get a letter like that, you don't get that letter unless, the guy's really scared, who wrote the letter.
And one of your more interesting interviews was also with a former LA Sheriff Deputy Preston Guillory, Guillory, thank you, who described a kind of hands-off policy towards the Manson family. So, and certainly there was kind of like a pattern of the Manson family being arrested and released.
Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about the Manson raid after the murder, and what do you think happened there? Well,
Preston, I wasn't the first one he told that to. He actually lost his job at the sheriff's department. He participated in the raid, and I think a day or two after the Manson family was identified as suspects in early December of '69, he went public and told a radio interviewer that his apartment.
That's not the Mae Brussels. That's not the Mae Brussels interview, is it?
No, he did. He got interviewed by Mae Brussels, but that was about a year later.
It sounded. The
first ones he spoke to were legitimate. I can't remember the call letters, like KTLA or K something, a radio interview. And I've got the reports of his dismissal. And he was fired for that. And what he told the radio station was that they had a hands-off policy, that they were ordered not to arrest them, that only certain officers could do arrests, and that the day that, a few days before the LAPD had the press conference to announce that they were suspects, that somebody came and took all the files out of the department. He also said there were cover sheets on every report. So he told that to the radio station. He lost his job, and then Mae Brussels interviewed him a year or two later, and Paul Krasner interviewed him. So I came along 30 years later. I don't think anybody had talked to him for years. And he basically repeated everything with the same detail to me that he had already told them. And I had already, gotten a lot of information supporting his claims. Once I had gotten into the sheriff's files through a back door, kind of through the generosity of one of the retired sheriffs, they let me in unofficially, another retired sheriff, to look at the whole case file there. And when Lee Baca, the head sheriff, found out about 7 years later, all holy hell was unleashed. But that's in the book, too. But anyway, in those files, you see that they had much closer surveillance of the family than had ever been reported before, to the point that they knew Manson's coming and goings on August 8th, the day of the murders. And also I found that Bugliosi's claim that this raid, which was at that point the largest in the law enforcement raid in the history of the state of California in 1969, it occurred a week after the murders, but officially had nothing to do with the murders. It was about mostly vehicle theft and underage runaways and drugs and girls. Well, I was the first one to get the warrant. I think it's available now online. But in the warrant, Manson's the only one identified, and he's identified as the principal target of the raid, and he's identified as someone on federal parole who's been making threats against not only the Panthers, but law enforcement that he encountered there. And Bugliosi writes that they were taken into custody on the Grand Theft Auto charges and released 3 days later because the warrant was misstated. But once I found the warrant, it wasn't misstated. It was 3 days off, but you're allowed, I think it's a 10-day window of the date that you say you're going to do the raid, before and after. And the sergeant who wrote it, Phil Gleason, told me that he'd lived for 30 years at that point, enraged at Bugliosi for writing in his book that this warrant that he'd worked so hard on was misstated, and that's why they were released. So that's another thing I try to find out in the book is, well, then why were they released?
And he had a ton of stolen credit cards.
And also, what hadn't ever been reported before, but I found this in the files of the sheriffs, was that not only could Manson have been charged, with stolen autos, runaway girls, narcotics, weapons. He's on federal parole. He's not allowed to be around runaway teenage girls or weapons or narcotics or stolen vehicles. But he also had, I think, four stolen credit cards in his pocket when he was arrested. He should have been, even if he wasn't charged, he should have been violated immediately, and that wasn't done. And you see through the book, prior to that, for the 2 years prior, there were more arrests than had been reported, even by Ed Sanders of Manson, that he was allowed to skate on. He was not charged or violated when both should have happened.
Right, which brings me to his very unorthodox, to say nicely, relationship with Roger Smith, his parole officer. So he was a parole officer, but he was also getting a doctorate in criminology at Berkeley. What was he studying, and how would the Manson family be good subjects for him?
Well, prior to Manson being released in March of '67, he had already been studying gangs and teenage violence, drugs, and gangs in the Bay Area. And he had started a couple programs, where they were using young kids as informants, and they were trying to study the nature of what drew kids to gangs and made them get involved in group violence and behavior like that. When Manson was released in '67, he was in another project called the San Francisco Project. And again, this could have been reported. I don't know why nobody ever found out about it till I did, but it was a very elaborate parole research project done by the state of California in the Bay Area, where the parole officers were given 3 different caseloads. And it was a study of recidivism and the relationship between parole officers and their clients. So they were trying to learn, obviously if you have a smaller caseload, then you can be a much more focused observer of your client's behavior and efforts to rehabilitate. Well, Roger had the lowest caseload and told me, and also it's in a couple of papers and books that David Smith, who ran the Haight-Ashbury Free Medical Clinic, wrote, by the end of '67, early '68, Manson was Roger Smith's only parolee. And also during that period, Roger Smith became the foster parent of Mary Bruner and Charles Manson's baby Pooh Bear when Mary Bruner was arrested and in custody in Mendocino. And also during that period when Mary Bruner was convicted with Susan Atkins of I think it was contributing to the delinquency of minors. They had reduced these charges that they were in a plea deal, but Atkins and Bruner had given, and a couple of the other women had given LSD to these kids in Mendocino County that they were trying to recruit into the family and been arrested for it. And the other women got off, but Atkins and Bruner, I guess, pled guilty in their deals. And during the probation report, where somebody from the state is assigned to evaluate the prognosis of those two women, whether or not they were prone to, if they got probation, to not commit crimes and to be good subjects for probation, which is the idea, or if they thought that the evaluator thought that they would go back to their life of crime, then they would recommend to the judge that they be imprisoned and not be eligible for probation or just not get it. Mm-hmm. So the person who did the evaluations interviewed Roger Smith, and I have the report. Roger Smith never disclosed to the interviewer that Manson had been his parole client, the same Manson who's identified in the same report as the person who's led these women astray and into a life of crime and is corrupting them. They interview he at that point had stopped being his parole officer about a month before, but he was still the foster parent of one of the Mary Bruner's kids. And he told them that they were both great candidates for probation. They shouldn't be sent to prison. Mm-hmm. I shouldn't say he lied, because when I showed him this, he claimed not to remember saying all this, but he said maybe it was the probation evaluator mistake, mm-hmm. but he said allegedly that he knew them about 2 years longer than he knew them. Mm-hmm. He called Atkins, a really trusting, nice person. All this stuff that, anybody who knew Atkins knew that she was crazy, even back then. Yeah. So Roger Smith's behavior in all this was pretty, curious. And you see how he reacts in the 2 times I had face-to-face meetings with him, the first in 2001 and the second in 2008 or 9, when I confront him. I mean, there's a lot of confrontational interviews in the book, primarily with Bugliosi, Terry Melcher, Roger mm-hmm. Smith, David Smith. Anybody who was alive, I showed up at their door to talk to.
And they were studying the effect of amphetamines and LSD on either rats or mice. It's, hard to tell.
Well, that was David Smith.
Oh, David Smith? Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So he was kind of replicating a model that another researcher, John Calhoun, had done on the effects of confinement of animals, and he was specifically trying to understand the parallels between communal living and the hate and drug use to these earlier rat studies by John Calhoun. And what was interesting was John Calhoun's confinement studies found that when you have these rats in this kind of cloistered setting where they live closer and closer together, ultimately a male rat, dominant male rat, emerged who would create, and this is the words of his own 1962 paper, I think, that was a very highly reported paper when it came out, because there were a lot of parallels to the cities that were erupting in race riots and stuff because of what they thought was too close quarters and drugs and stuff. But that a dominant male rat would emerge and create a harem of female rat followers, and that the weaker rats would be subjugated by the main male rat and would become frenzied killers and sometimes attack other rat nests and in frenzied berserk, and those are his words, assaults that would leave limbs of the murdered rats thrown around with blood. So David was doing the same mice research for his PhD thesis in 66 and 67 that then he transferred over to humans when he created the Haight-Ashbury Free Medical Clinic. He was studying he wasn't administering drugs, or he shouldn't have been. Who knows? But officially he wasn't. But he was studying the effects of crowded communal type living and LSD and amphetamines in the violence that kind of erupted in hate beginning in 67 and getting much worse in 68. And Roger Smith did the same thing, but his focus was more on amphetamines and the violence.
Right, and some of the Manson women said they took amphetamines before the murder, correct?
Yeah, so did Tex Watson, yeah. And, that was something that Bugliosi emphasized over and over again at the trial and in his book, was that he had to show the jury that none of the defendants were at all unaccountable the night of the murder. So he had to get Linda Kasabian on the stand to testify again and again that, nobody had taken drugs that night. And had they taken drugs, they still would have been convicted, most likely. But when they got to the death penalty phase of the trial, if their defense attorneys could prove that they had diminished capacity because they were on drugs, then they probably wouldn't have gotten the death penalty. And Bugliosi maintained that none of them were on drugs that night, and I'm pretty sure he knew that. I suggested in the book, but I believe that Linda Kasabian's testimony was scripted by Vince.
Interesting. And Vince had a problem in that he had to prove that Manson had total power over these women, but that the women also had free will and were accountable at the same time. So, I just sat through the NXIVM trial where the issue of coercive control.
You attended it?
Yeah.
Wow.
And a lot of the hearings too. And so, they had experts talking about coercive control. And so how do you feel about the Manson women and their culpability in the murders? Are they less culpable? Just as culpable? Did he pick women that were sort of sociopathic to do his bidding, or?
Well, Vince said in Helter Skelter in that trial, and he needed to do this, like you said, to show that even though they were under Manson's control, they also acted out of their own free will. And he writes in the book in a trial, he said that Manson had developed some type of technology to locate the willingness to murder in these people who otherwise, as he writes, wouldn't have done it if they had never been exposed to Manson. He had found like a switch or a trigger that he activated. And once it was activated, then they did it, and they were responsible for doing it. And that's what's pretty fascinating. And, we ended up having to leave so much out of the book, but if you really were thinking about doing a follow-up, but the studies that David Smith was doing at the time on LSD was why some people were more susceptible and suggestible to becoming completely different personalities after just one use of LSD when others weren't. And they were trying to find out how you could discover who would react a certain way. He invented a phrase for it. He called it the psychedelic syndrome, where a person who would have LSD once or repeatedly would have a complete personality change. And he's like, he started that study in 1967. The Manson family officially kind of formed in the summer of 67. And they were, it's almost like he defined what Manson did, was he found women who he could not only subjugate and control, but he found the switch. His study paralleled what Bugliosi claimed was how Manson got them to kill. So it's all pretty fascinating. I didn't follow any of the coverage of the NXIVM trial because I was still doing so much work on the book. Even though we finished it, there was still all the legal work and publicity and stuff. And I thought if I start following that case, I'll never finish what I need to do with the fact checkers and whatnot. So I'm waiting until a couple months from now and really looking forward to immersing myself in it because I want to look at the parallel. Because I've read all the
very many parallels, and also Eddie Albert comes into the. I'll talk to you a little bit, I guess. I don't want to get thrown off, but it was a lot of parallels I saw. I didn't read Helter Skelter, so I will say that now. I think that's probably pretty obvious in this interview.
Oh no, I had no idea. I couldn't tell.
So I was also really interested in the Dr. Jolly and West was also at the hate clinic at the same time, and you discovered some letters between him and Gottlieb, who was head of the CIA around 1952. And
Right.
what was the content of those letters, and what had he discovered?
Well, Gottlieb was the one who was the head of the technical services section of the CIA.
Oh, he wasn't totally head of the CIA at that point, or was he ever head of the CIA?
No, Gottlieb was never the head of the CIA.
Oh, okay.
Richard Helms, who was
right.
Gottlieb's
Okay.
immediate supervisor, became the head of the CIA, I think in 65 or something.
Okay.
But when they initiated MKUltra in 52, it was actually the evolution of a couple other prior projects in brainwashing and behavior modification. But they officially instituted, under Alan Dulles' orders, he was the head of the CIA in 52, this MKUltra project, and Sidney Gottlieb was kind of the mad scientist at the CIA that organized it and contracted researchers on the outside to secretly perform these really horrific experiments using LSD, other drugs that hadn't even been identified by name or tested, and in combination with things like sleep deprivation, all the stuff Manson did, hypnosis, to see if they could create what their ultimate objective was, to create Manchurian candidates as we know them from popular culture, from the book and the movie, or two movies now, which were programmed assassins, people who would kill and be amnesiac of the programming that made them kill. And West contracted with the program in 1953, about a year into its existence. And in 1977, the allegations were first made public by Seymour Hersh, the journalist for the New York Times, on the front page of the New York Times. And West was named as one of 6 or 8 subcontracted researchers who had done this in academia and also when they were at military bases for 20 years. And West vigorously denied it and said he had nothing to do with the program, that they had approached him and he refused and advised them not to do any kind of research or work with LSD because it wasn't safe for humans and it was also unpredictable. And he went to his grave in 99, shortly before I began reporting this story, insisting, every time the allegations came up that they were lies, and was threatening libel cases against anybody who said he was part of it. Well, once he died, I got access to his archive at UCLA, where he had ended his career. The last 25 years of his career, he ran the Neuroscience Institute and Psychiatric Department at UCLA. And this filed, and, it was 160 boxes at the time. I think they've got new boxes since then, were these letters that he had, correspondence between him and Gottlieb starting in 53 and going to about 56, discussing these very experiments that he denied ever doing, how he was going to use LSD and other drugs in combination with hypnosis on patients, prisoners, and the general population without their awareness, to see if he could create amnesias, create fugue states, remove true memories, replace them with false memories, all the stuff that, he was accused of doing. And it just amazed me that when this stuff came out in 77, the places that West had already worked, UCLA, the University of Oklahoma, and the Lackland Air Force Base in Texas, where he had done all this research, never investigated him. They took his works. I talked to the chancellor of UCLA. I talked to the chancellor of the University of Oklahoma, the very top people who were there at the time. And both of them said, well, Jolly told us that these were lies and he had nothing to do with it, so we took his word for it. I said, don't you understand, if it was true and he took an oath with the CIA, he can't say that he did it? So I actually, once I got a little wiser and interviewed more people, I found out they didn't want to investigate it, because if they did and it was proven that he had done this, they could have been liable for millions and millions of dollars for the people that had been tested on.
Interesting. So you said that the story became an obsession, but you don't regret it. How do you know when a story sort of crosses the line into an obsession?
When you miss the first deadline, and then the second, and then the third, and then you got the editor-in-chief of the magazine as obsessed as you are, giving you all the money you need to report it for 18 months and coming to your house and going over all your spreadsheets on the floor of your apartment, then you realize, I infected a couple other people along the way with the obsession. And I might have said I didn't regret it, but sometimes I do regret it, and it depends on the time of the day that you speak to me. I'm glad now because I feel like, I'm really glad. I'm happy because there's a book. And even if it didn't sell a single copy, just that I know there's a book available that has all of the I have 60 pages of endnotes with all my sourcing. And I have two websites, one on Instagram and one on Facebook, where I'm still putting up scanned documents. Just I want everything out there, and now I can die and not regret the last 20 years of my life. If I hadn't gotten the book out, it would have been a horrible, horrible existence for me. I still don't know that the 20 years was worth it, but I guess what I'm saying is I don't regret it now that there's a book and there's a record, a document that shows everything, almost everything I did. There's still at least 30 or 40% of material that my collaborator and I are trying to decide what to do with, whether to do a follow-up book or podcast or documentary. We've sold the scripted rights, but we want to do something non-fictional with the stuff that didn't end up in the book.
Interesting. So do you have plans to archive sort of all your research? Like, give it to a at some
point.
Or?
I've been asked that a couple times, and I've actually been approached by someone from, let's just say an institution that would purchase it. But I can't let it go until I'm done using it. I need all of it, But definitely, when I do whatever I do next, hopefully that'll be the last thing I do with it. Then I definitely want it out of my apartment and my, right. I've got a bunch of different receptacles at different places because I have copies. And there could be an earthquake at any time in California, or there could be a fire, robbery, whatever. So I have stuff not in the apartment. Some of the most important stuff and safety deposit boxes and whatnot. But I'd love to just let go all of that, and it would feel good to know that someone had it organized and available to the public someplace. But that's a ways off because I'm definitely going to do something with what we didn't use. And once we decide what to do, it'll probably be another 2 or 3 years putting together whatever it is. Then at that point, when I'm really done with it, I'll make it all available.
Well, I'm really glad that you wrote this book and did this 20 years of research, and I really recommend everyone to get this book, even if you're not interested in Manson, like I was. It's a fascinating read. Chaos, Tom O'Neill. Thank you so much.
Yeah, and Roberta, thank you. But also, if they want to go and see documents, they don't even need to get the book. I have an Instagram page and a Facebook page. One's called Chaos the Book, and one's called, I can never remember that stuff. I know it's important. Maybe if they just Google my name Manson and Instagram, or my name Manson and Facebook, they can find it. But I just want people to see everything. And the Instagram isn't as good as the Facebook because I'm so bad with the technology of framing and stuff. And when I get back, I'm going to hire a kid, like a knowledgeable millennial kid, to fix everything and make it more understandable. But there's a lot of stuff that I think might interest people on those two sites, and they'll see that this stuff, everything is corroborated and documented.
Okay, I'll try to link that in the description of this episode.
Oh, super.
Okay, so thanks so much.
All right, Roberta.